In 2008, the International Roguelike Development Conference was held in Berlin, where players and developers congregated to create a guideline for how to determine if a game is a roguelike. This is some pretty nerdy stuff, but bear with me here. These factors would later be referred to as the Berlin interpretation. For the people watching that might not even know what a roguelike is, I would like to go through some of the parameters that the Berlin interpretation set forth to see if you could think of any games off the top of your head that could fit this mold. The 8 high-value factors that were created are: 1. The game's environment must be procedurally generated and random to increase replayability. 2. The game utilizes permadeath. If you die, you start back at the beginning of the game to start a new run. 3. The game is turn-based, allowing the player enough time to make decisions. 4. The game is non-modal, meaning that the player should be allowed to perform any action regardless of where they are in the game. 5. The game should have complex systems, meaning it must allow the player multiple ways to achieve their goals that they can choose from. 6. The game should have resource management, including but not limited to health and stamina for the player to effectively survive in the dungeon. 7. The game is focused on hack and slash gameplay. There shouldn't be any peaceful options to completing the game. And finally, 8. The game should force you to discover the nature of the items you find, meaning that exploration of not only the map, but your items should help incentivize replayability. It should be worth noting that these factors only determine how roguelike a game is, and missing any of these factors doesn't mean the game is not a roguelike. With that being said, can you think of any game that follows all 8 of these factors exactly? Even when creating these rules, developers had realized their own games that were referred to as roguelikes were not exactly following all of these tenets. For example, the developer of the game Angband or Angband, I'm sorry, I'm not really sure, but they had realized the existence of the shop in their game broke the non-modality factor. Having a shop meant that there was a different mode of the game where the player could only perform certain actions, like buying items when the shop was present. As stated in my last video, genres are only as good as their utility and function. Roguelikes are the only gaming genre that have set parameters for determining if that game is true to form, and if it deviates too much from the mold, then it becomes what's called a roguelite, which are games that usually have some sort of permadeath with procedurally generated environments like roguelikes, but also include a meta progression system or set of systems that carry over from run to run. Instead of all of your progress only being contingent on how far you can go in a single run using the tools given to you, it's now contingent on whether you have accumulated enough wealth or power in the game's systems to actually complete the run. This can be seen in games like Dead Cells, where you start off pretty weak with not many weapons or upgrades to choose from in your first couple of runs. As you collect more cells, however, you can use them to purchase permanent upgrades and weapons for your character that will be available to you on future runs, thus allowing the player to increase the likelihood of them receiving more powerful weapons. As an aside, all of this is stemmed from a game called Rogue, released in 1980, that was popularized through its use of permadeath and procedural generation. As you can probably tell, this game would help inspire the entire genre and allow for this debate between the distinction of roguelike and roguelite. This video is intended to question whether roguelikes are supposed to be difficult, but I think highlighting this debate and giving my opinion will be helpful to informing you all where I'm coming from. Personally, I believe this distinction is not useful or helpful, along with the Berlin interpretation. Even if not following all of these factors, the game can still be referred to as a roguelike, which makes me question establishing the rules in the first place. And regardless of intention, creating these parameters gives justification for gatekeeping, which I think leads to stifling creativity and innovation. Now, despite that, we have seen great roguelite games that are even Game of the Year winners, so it might not be a factor of the game's success, but we can still logically draw these implications. If developers wanted to try and make their games fit this mold, what would be the point of purchasing new roguelike games according to their definition? Some may see this as contradictory because my last video talked about the difference difference between a Metroidvania and a Metroidbrania. But even though these are really niche genres, they are separate points. There are huge differences in gameplay styles and mechanics between games like Ori and the Will of the Wisps and The Witness, and they should be categorized in different genres. But there are subtle similarities between these games in terms of exploration and progression that we can analyze and connect these similarities to other games. However, when I'm comparing games like Enter the Gungeon to Hades, these are games with huge similarities but smaller differences. Yet, they're still big enough for people to find a distinction, which I don't think is very necessary. I think a more apt comparison would be to consider one more traditional and the other more modern, as it is pretty rare to see commercially successful traditional roguelikes within the past decade or so. It's completely fine for people to find this distinction necessary because, as I have said, genres are as good as their function, and if people prefer a traditional roguelike to a modern one, then that's completely fine. It's more or less the gatekeeping that I'm not a fan of, and the implication that some games are not true to form than others. Within the roguelike genre is a wide umbrella of games that involve the core design aspects. Games like these often have to involve balancing reasonable yet difficult goals with challenging experiences. This has to be taken into consideration for ensuring that players get hooked to the game and understand the mechanics quickly, and then are retained for as long as possible. Eventually, once a player finishes a run for the first time, developers will try to find ways to incentivize players to do more runs. There are a couple ways that devs attempt to retain players, which include using a compelling narrative. Hades is praised for its capability of telling a great story both during and after your runs when you return back to the House of Hades, your hub world. This blend of storytelling and gameplay is especially highlighted when you help reunite Orpheus and Eurydice as a side quest. One character is located in the hub world of the game, while the other is only able to be accessed at a certain point in your path out of the underworld, and that's even when the RNG is in your favor. Acting as the messenger in this relationship, lines of dialogue will only be available after certain checkpoints in the main story, which of course allows players to replay the run so they could advance in their other stories. Another way developers will attempt to retain their players as long as possible is through the promise of variety and discovery, meaning gameplay aspects like secret objectives and gaining new upgrades, allowing you to mess with different builds and combos, are offered and encouraged to try. All of this being supported by a robust RNG system to ensure that every run is different, can make for addicting gameplay and will inevitably result in one more run. Risk of Rain 2 allows for a variety of gameplay styles that encourage players to explore what the game offers and to test the viability of different styles of play. From the get-go, the roster of players you can choose from is a testament to how much variety there is. From Loader or Mercenary, which are two highly mobile melee fighters, yet with extremely different playstyles, all the way to Rex, the deadly plant that heals every time you deal damage. There's plenty to choose from. Coupled with the fact you can have unlimited upgrades throughout a run can make it seem like the possibilities are endless. Generally, the goal for roguelikes is for players to find an object, power-up, or weapon, and be able to test the limits of whatever they find, and Risk of Rain 2 excels in that. Not only is exploration of the environment a primary driving force of the gameplay in a roguelike, so is the discovery of finding out what your items can do, like figuring out what the bullet weapon can do in Enter the Gungeon. It shoots guns that then shoots more bullets. Roguelikes also tend to be combat-centered, which had me wondering if combat was required for a game to be a roguelike, and if so, why? There are some games that are considered to be roguelikes with virtually no combat systems. For instance, the game Luck Be a Landlord is a deck-building game that involves you earning money through slot machines to pay rent, and if you miss a month's rent payment, then you lose the game and have to start over. What makes this game a roguelike is obviously how progression is felt in the game. Permadeath and procedural generation is baked into the core gameplay, which makes it impossible to not consider it a roguelike. These are also the reasons why combat is the preferred vehicle for this gameplay. It's an incredibly simple and effective way to stop a player's progression, yet also still provides variability and randomness. Thinking back to the original question of this video, which I know it took a while to get here, but difficulty in video games can be hard to measure. Obviously, because some players might see some things as more challenging than others, which is completely based on experience and preference. With that being said, typically roguelikes don't have difficulty settings that we can turn on or off, minus a couple of exceptions like Hades God mode, but that's provided for players who only want to know the story. Typically in roguelikes, you don't have easy, normal, hard, very hard. That's not really seen. Difficulty, though, is a huge consideration for developers of roguelikes, because games like Spelunky have the same level of difficulty the entire time, and it's your skill and knowledge of the game that gets better from run to run. Whereas Dead Cells, as mentioned previously, allows you to get permanent upgrades and unlocked weapons. So the game does get easier over time through its mechanics, allowing you to beat the game eventually even if you're not very skilled. And some games find a balance of both. All in all, yes, roguelikes do need to have a sense of difficulty to the game in order for players to feel the consequences of the permadeath aspect. And also, it allows players to find their own playstyle that fits them, so they can take some sort of ownership of the game and create an unforgettable experience when they finally complete their run for the first time. Thank you so much for checking out my video. If you want to leave a comment letting me know what you think, please go right ahead. Also, go ahead and like and subscribe the channel. I really do appreciate any support that you can give. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your loved ones, tell your dog, anyone that can press the subscribe button. Anyway, thank you so much and peace out.